For the second half of the lecture on chapter 12, we're going to look a little more on some issues about development, and then a lot about different kind of contexts in which development occurs, and different kinds of issues related to that. Social development is an area that we didn't touch on in the last section, so we'll spend a few slides talking about some of the key points in this section. Peer relations comes up, of course, in this, as we had said earlier, that children are reaching outside of their family system by the end of this early childhood period, and really they're preparing for school. And the attachment style that was established earlier in the child's life is really reflected in their peer relations. So again, the secure and insecure attachments and all the different kinds of qualities about how one interacts with another person plays out in peer relationships as well. But even in the best of circumstances and the best of relationships, conflicts and as the author refers to them, falling outs or fallings out is probably the proper term, aren't really uncommon at all. Kids are still trying to learn how to negotiate and be fair in their relationships and those kinds of things. And so there's going to be some sparks flying from time to time, most likely. As we probably know anyway, children have a tendency to gravitate towards peers of the same gender. Boys at this age prefer to be with other boys, and girls tend to be want to be with other girls as well. And there are some ideas later on in the chapter about some of the things that may contribute to that, including, I think, the mirror neurons, I think, may have a part to play in that. About racial and ethnic identity, we used to always tell people, and I still believe this, that one way to ensure that you're going to raise children that have fewer racial prejudices and biases and ethnic prejudices and biases is to be sure that they're put in environments at a very young age where they mix with children from other ethnic backgrounds and other racial categories, and so that they see that we're all human beings and they're very used to interacting with other people. In fact, the text points out that children learn their own racial identity before they can identify the race of other people. And so somehow they begin to recognize the group they belong to before they begin to see that other children, other peers are related to other groups. And there's some indication that racial and ethnic awareness may be found to occur as early as age 3 with children. Many children, and of course, this isn't really talking about the the prejudices and discrimination experiences and things like that children in minority groups might run into, and various kinds of microaggressions and things like this. And so we're kind of glossing over those issues here as we talk about development on a more typical basis. But many studies conclude that children of various races all around the world, and there are many different studies that's mentioned in the text about this, that when presented with the opportunity to pick a white doll or a doll of their own racial minority group, in fact, many children prefer to pick the Caucasian doll, and that, I think, just reflects the dominance that the Caucasian race, for lack of better terms, has established all around the globe, really, in so many ways. There are a number of instances of this, and where even, like, for instance, there have been some studies about African American adults tending to prefer lighter skinned African American adults when picking ideals and things like this than darker skin. Again, kind of reflecting this bit of obsession or the bit of dominance that the white race has established around the globe. Now, an interesting exception to this is for those children who grow up in predominantly African American communities. They select the doll of their own race, which is very interesting. But at the same time, kids being kids, when not asked to choose a race, they show interest in the dolls of all colors and don't make judgments about the dolls based on their race or ethnic qualities. Play is as we've mentioned earlier, is a very big issue in this particular stage of development. I mean, there's so many things that go on in children's play that just is so vital. I mean, the development of motor skills, the learning problem solving and communication skills, so that that really aids their cognitive development. They in their interactions with peers and others, they learn to cooperate, and when there are conflicts, to resolve those conflicts. At least hopefully so. They experience emotional growth through the expression of feelings and can gain self-confidence, all those kinds of things. And I think the author points out that children's work is play. And this is where they sort things out about the world around them. They come to understand themselves in relation to the rest of the world. Sometimes you'll see them playing out roles of other people in their lives, and that's a way that they go about, well, perspective taking, first of all, learning about what might motivate people to do what they do, as well as to just understand the motivations of important people in their lives. And so play is definitely a major area for children at this stage of their development. And the text goes into quite a bit of detail about the kind of toys that are suited to the different age groups year by year, and I just would refer you to the text for that if you want that information. There's some good bits of information there. There's different types of play that kids engage in, whether it be fantasy play or learning play, where they focus on language and thinking skills, or group fantasies, the socio-dramatic plays, so to speak, where, well, when we were little kids, we played cowboys and Indians, but now hopefully there's a little more sophisticated kind of play that kids engage in. And in this age group, the play is sort of in between the predominantly fantasy play of toddlers. Remember, they're still very focused on symbolism in the toddler stage, and so a lot of that play is fantasy play, is symbolic play, whereas as children get into school, their play by necessity begins to be more focused upon rules and structure and things like that, the kinds of things that enable school age middle childhood kids to get along with kids from other homes and other environments and things like this. And so this age group in early childhood is kind of in between those two stages, and I think their play is going to reflect a little bit of both stages at different times. Definitely, the more structured play is something that indicates some movement along their level of sophistication. Now we talk a little bit about developmental delays. There's not a whole lot devoted to this topic in this chapter, but they discuss the different kinds of circumstances that make developmental delays may be characterized. And as the text points out, it's important to recognize that some of those delays are not permanent conditions. They're temporary delays in development. It's something that really ought to be assessed if delays are observed among very young children. In the Kenai Peninsula, I'm familiar with, it was called Infant Learning Program, but I think there are other early intervention programs, I think is what they're called, around the state in different locations, and they're very important in terms of providing for screening for kids for developmental disabilities that, well, here it says 9, 18, and 24 or 30 months. After the child reaches 3 years of age, at least in the Kenai, and I think this is probably true all around the state of Alaska, the school system becomes responsible for the screening for developmental disabilities. The earlier these things are caught, the faster work can begin to proceed to see whether there's anything that can, well, to help if it's a temporary disability or a delay, rather, to help the child pass that delay. If it's likely to be a lifelong condition, to help the child and the family to begin to learn ways to work around that condition as much as possible and to work with it. Now, there are federal programs that the Individuals with Disabilities Act that, among other things, requires that services for infants and toddlers be provided when they have developmental delays in cognitive, motor, communication, social, emotional development. And I think the early intervention programs as a part of that are a part of that program. A lot of research going on for some of those more lifelong conditions that are mentioned here: cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, seizure disorders, autism, spectrum disorders. Autism has become much more prominent in diagnoses in the last 10 years or so. And I'll say this to you, yeah, I have my issues with diagnoses anyway, but I think probably for developmental issues and physically related issues, diagnoses are very helpful. They're more of a medical focus here, not necessarily, but not necessarily talking about psychological aspects. Although autism spectrum disorder certainly has a lot of psychological aspects. Interesting, I think elsewhere in this lecture, it's going to touch on the possibility. There's research being done that suggests that autism may come from malfunctioning of the mirror neurons that we were talking about in the last lecture. But in any event, there's a lot of psychological implications about that diagnosis. And over the years of my career, I've noticed varying diagnoses that sort of became the diagnosis of the day, and became very chic, and people rushed to make such a diagnosis, attention deficit disorder being one of them at one time, and there have been others as well. And I'm certainly not denying the existence of autism and the whole spectrum of disorders that relate to autism, and it's very real for those children that legitimately have it. But my suggestion is not to rush to such a diagnosis, and to really look carefully at what's going on with the child, so that we don't just kind of jump on a popular bandwagon these days. Sometimes there's been a noted increase in autism diagnoses in the United States in the last so many years, and sometimes the question that goes into my head is how much of that is an increase in the disorder. How much of it is an increase in our education that enables us to diagnose the disorder and see it when we didn't see it before, and how much of it reflects, trainings that professionals have gone to that, the old saying is if your toolbox is mostly made out of hammers, everything's going to start looking like nails, so I don't know, it's just something for you to keep in mind. But in any event, there's a lot of research about autism these days, and it's certainly something that falls into this category of developmental disruptions. The children of these disorders and other developmental disorders, some more severe, some less, then I say the children, the parents of these children often experience a great deal of stress, not only in learning how to attend to the peculiar needs of that child with that disability, but also oftentimes struggle with feelings of guilt associated with thinking, particularly those conditions that might be genetically related. And these are things that are important for you to understand. I have noticed sometimes that on a superficial level, I'm talking about here, that parents of disabled children can be very difficult to work with. They can be very demanding. They can be pretty hostile sometimes. And that's probably the advocacy role, and there's nothing wrong with that. But just understand that sometimes there are other issues, that the stress and the other kinds of feelings that might be behind that too. And try to be sensitive to that as you work with parents with disabled children. Early childhood education. The opening panel, I think I put in this week's learning unit, speaks to the importance of early childhood education, and there are just so much research going on indicate how important and how helpful early childhood education can be. Neuroscientific studies show the importance of brain development, particularly in the early years. Social science research points to how high-quality early childhood education improves readiness for primary school. The quotes from the Brookings Institute in my opening panel suggest that. And econometric measures, basically dollars and cents, that early childhood education saves society significant amounts of money over time for a number of different reasons. One of the interesting thing is this text talks about how the mothers of children who are in quality early childhood education programs earn more per year, and over the period of time, that means their earnings are increased over the course of a lifetime, which puts more money into the economy. And so even for those conservatives that don't like these kind of prevention programs and things like this, that's one way you can kind of snag them into, I think I've mentioned that elsewhere, snag them into cooperating with you. There are particular issues with children from low-income homes in highly unequal societies, and I think the United States would be one of those. There are evidence in our own nation that low-income and racial minority students do not have equal access to quality early education programs compared to their peers. That's certainly no surprise to any of us. And nowadays, even middle-class families are having more and more trouble accessing quality early childhood education. The wealthy, the text talks about how the wealthy can put their kids in these high-quality programs, but most of us couldn't afford those things. And so, there should be a push for more, I think, more federal involvement with the current administration and the Secretary of Education, at least as exists in 2018. I don't see that happening in the near future. So anyway, most societies prioritize education on other levels, primary, secondary, tertiary education, and really don't put a lot of focus on early childhood education. And this is an area of, I think, as I mentioned in the opening slide, that's worth our advocacy as time goes on. In the multi-generational family, this is the family where kids are being raised by grandparents. Sometimes the parents live in a home. I think even almost half of those situations, I believe, the parents are living in the home as well, but the grandparents have one role or another in raising children. Now, this mentions the roles that parents play for the 2 to 6 year old educator and all those kinds of things that we've been talking about all along, about social development and cognitive development. And also advocate, and this is particularly true for parents with children who have developmental disabilities, but true for any parent of children, when issues arise, because kids oftentimes don't have a voice for themselves. But the number of children being cared for by grandparents has risen rapidly since the economic recession of 2008. Some of those grandparents are actually doing the primary parenting or the sole parenting for these children, and some of them experience it, not surprisingly, as a rewarding experience and giving a new purpose in life, and others, respond to it with feelings of physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, and worry, and those kinds of things. They just didn't anticipate raising kids at this stage of their life anymore. Children that are cared for by persons other than their parents, whether it be grandparents, aunts, uncles, foster parents, those kinds of things, oftentimes, usually will suffer grief and loss. And so sometimes when you see problem behaviors with children in these settings, that's something you want to look at and try to assess for, is whether or not there is some grief and loss process going on here that may not change the way they act so much, although you might be able to focus upon that, but it might just help the caretaker to recognize and understand what's going on and respond more helpfully as a result of that. But little kids at this age in particular just don't have the vocabulary usually to really process these feelings with you. So there are a number of factors here that are identified as risks to healthy development, and poverty being one of them. And we've touched on this before. I'm sure we'll touch on it again throughout the course of this semester, because it's such an important factor in persons' lives. the text says the adverse effects of low socioeconomic status on mental and physical health outcomes are as close to a universal truth as social science has offered. That's a quote from an author that the authors of this text are quoting from. But I think there's some truth to that. There's study after study of this, and the adverse effects are clearly evident. How society responds to this, of course, is to blame the poor and the poor parents for the problems that arise from poverty. But we know that the system, the economic system, the social system, the institutions in our society all work together to create the issues related to poverty. In the world's richest nations, number of children, proportion of children rather, living in poverty is increasing. And once again, we have the second highest rate of children living in poverty of 35 economically advanced nations around the world. This is just these statistics about children and how we're caring for them and families, I think is just a total shame for our society. Homelessness, which certainly connects into poverty in many respects, is an issue that children have to face from time to time. Families with children make up a third of the homeless population. This is something that's often overlooked when people think about the homeless, as the number of children that are involved with this. And kids that are homeless, as you can imagine, exposed to more sickness, more violence in the environment, more emotional behavior problems, more problems with developmental delays, disrupted school attendance, whether because they move a lot or because there's just transportation issues getting to and from school from temporary quarters. That's another thing that on the Kenai and elsewhere, and I don't know which federal program it is, but the school districts have an individual specifically assigned to seek out homeless children and arrange for them to make sure they get into school. And these include kids that are older, that are couch surfing and those kinds of things, as well as children and younger children with families. And the rate of homelessness in your area, I think, wherever you're living, would shock you. Even as social workers, you may be shocked. A couple slides on parental discipline. I forget his first name, but Baumrind is his last name, identified 4 parenting styles, and I referenced this a little earlier in this lecture, based on dimensions of warmth and control. I think I referred to it as structure and nurturance, or kindness and firmness. When I worked at the children's home and worked more specifically in a behavior treatment program for adolescents who were determined to be, by the courts, ungovernable. Other states, they call them children in need of supervision. Status offenders, basically. We had a parenting class and we used a model similar to Baumrind's, but it was actually a cognitive therapist by the name of Paul Hauck, Hauck, who had a model called Patterns of Kindness and Firmness. And you can see how that connects to warmth and control, kindness and firmness. And so each of these particular models, we had a matrix, of kind and firm, kind and not firm, not kind and firm, and not kind and not firm. And the not kind and not firm is just the worst, of all 4 models. But obviously kind and firm was the model that was preferred. That's giving that child structure and nurturance that allow them to explore, but within reasonable limits. So the 4 styles here: authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, and disengaged. And the disengaged is capitalized purely by a mistake. There is no other reason why it should be. Authoritarian is that the not kind and firm parent. That's can be abusive parents are often authoritarians, unkind and firm. So they have expectations of kids, and you can expect, as you would expect, they're going to produce very nervous children who are afraid to, explore and experiment. And again, this kind of carries through, throughout the developmental trajectory, so to speak. The authoritative, well, let me skip over that. The permissive parent would be let me get this right, not firm and kind, or warm, high in warmth and low in control, if you want to look at it that way. And this parent, they're really nice to the kids and everything, but really there's nothing the kids can do that deserves correction. Everything the kid does is fine, and they're just out there exploring the world, and why should we punish them? And this is the parent that would probably rush to school and insist that the fight that the child was in wasn't her son's fault or his daughter's fault. It was because of this and that and those kinds of things. And these kids oftentimes grow up to be pretty much out of control and also very demanding. A lot of times they just kind of expect that the world owes them a living, and you'll see that in these kinds of coming from these kinds of parenting styles. Disengaged parents, that's the not kind and not firm parent, and as I said earlier, that's probably the parenting style from hell, where it's a totally the parent's just not involved at all with the child. The parent offers no correction, really doesn't like the child, and there's no warmth in interaction with them or anything like this. And this kid's really quite lost, really has difficulties connecting with other people, and trusting other people for that matter, has no boundaries. These children oftentimes will wind up in a juvenile detention center because if parents don't manage these kids, the system is going to have to. And we've always said that teenagers, if they don't have the right kind of limits placed on them, are going to act out until somebody places limits on them, because limits help them feel safe. They know where it has to stop. And this is true for younger children, of course. And that's where the authoritative parent comes in. That's the kind and firm, or high warmth, high control, and offering a lot of nurturance and a lot of structure. And so kids know what their limits are with this kind of parent, but they have a parent that's supportive of them. Probably is the authoritative parent generally wants to engage the child in a discussion, rather than laying down the law and saying this is the way it's going to be, it's my way or the highway, which is that not kind feature. The kind parent will sit down and say, let's talk about why we need this rule. What would happen if we didn't have this rule, that kind of thing, to get the wheels turning in the kid's head. Now, age appropriately, this might not work so well with 4-year-old, depends on what it is, I guess, but certainly with adolescents, to get them engaged. I have a feeling we'll probably revisit this model again later in the semester. Now, other theorists, Greenspan being one of them, and there were a few others that were mentioned in the text, have, of course, taken a very clear and easy model, one that's really easy to give to other people, and because there's four kinds and very predictable kinds of results about the kind of children that result. Added a third dimension, which is autonomy granting, and I suppose autonomy granting is different from not being firm in control, and so instead of having 4 different styles, there's 8 different styles, and it's in the text. I'm not going to put them up here, but it's in the text if you want to look at it further. And it is certainly something that maybe is worth considering adding that quality as well. Now, interesting about physical discipline, there have been studies that demonstrate or that suggest that, low-income parents, working class parents, really tend to be more authoritarian, which implies that there is more physical discipline used. I don't hear that. I don't see that in this text. That's stuff that we were told in the past, that working class parents tend to resort to physical discipline more. That their style, which really is about conforming and about authoritarian control, reflects the work environment that many of them are working in, where they really don't have a lot of voice in what goes on. They just go in and they're supposed to get the job done and get out of there. If they don't, they've got consequences to pay, those kinds of things. Maybe an overgeneralization, but that is that's one style of parenting, let's say, that seems to be associated with socioeconomics. Parents with more education and thus presumably higher income tend to use that authoritative style that I was referring to. And that process of engaging the child in thinking things through with them, I think, is called induction. And it's really, a lot of us think that kids are more likely to comply with structure given to them. Again, I'm talking about older children in particular, when they have participated in the development of that structure, so to speak. Now, it doesn't mean that authoritative parents don't turn over control and don't let the kids overrule them if they don't agree in the end, but they try to engage the kid in understanding what's going on. Interestingly, this says low-income parents tend to allow their children less supervision in their leisure activities, and actually, my own experience suggests that's true. My own experience. I'm not saying necessarily that a study would. Well, it does say studies would support that, but also that parents with higher education, while they want to engage the child in helping to develop the rules and understand them and everything like that, still keep a closer eye on them in leisure activity and tend to push them more towards structured activities. So there's a little less autonomy in that. And again, that's where that autonomy granting dimension would come into play, I suppose. So, the text says that with white kids, physical discipline doesn't work. It really backfires. But with a lot of African American kids, it does work, and that African American kids tend to see the physical discipline as being justified and understand the reason for it more than white kids do. And it's an interesting feature that I've never really been exposed to before. But the point is, and this makes total sense, that the context of the discipline and the meaning of that it's attributed to the discipline is certainly going to impact its or influence its impact, I should say. So different parenting styles are going to work better or worse in different developmental niches. And again, this is not too surprising. So here's just a little matrix, and the textbook does not have the disengaged style in this. I think Baumright originally started with the first three styles and added the disengaged parent later. Again, when you look at kindness and firmness, really the fourth one makes total sense. And so I added this to what was in the text. You see, I figured out how to work with tables, prearranged tables in PowerPoint. I'm really growing. Another issue, divorce, that, can really intrude in healthy development of a child. Now, depending upon the age of the child, the studies have shown that divorce is going to impact that child differently. And one of the age groups that has the hardest time understanding it and processing it, I guess, is the younger age group, because they can't really sit down and understand, that mommy and daddy are having difficulties. There are other complications with older age groups that I'm not going to get into here because of, concrete thinking and things like this. But for this young group, it's just very difficult for them to understand. And what happens a lot of times, their egocentrism really kind of gives them the sense that somehow this divorce might be because of their bad behavior, something that they've done wrong. And they might feel that the parent that's leaving is doing so because he didn't like him anymore or something like that. So this is something we need to keep in mind as we work with children of divorce. The studies, the Wallerstein studies were really and they're mentioned as being, the ones that talk about, they did like this massive longitudinal study of children in divorce and talked about all the problems that children in divorce had as adults and, in their adult relationships as well. And while all of that is true, it always struck me that it was just such a doomsaying kind of a study. And there have been other studies since that kind of suggest it doesn't have to be quite that bad. And I'm glad to hear that, to be honest with you. I think that a lot of it has to do with how the parents handle it, as it says here. The more issues there are between the parents, the harder it's going to be with that child. Because, if parents were able to keep those boundaries between the parents and the children firm enough that they weren't engaged in the conflict between the parents, it might not trouble the children quite as much. But as often happens in these situations, the kids are exposed to the conflict. Sometimes perhaps the parents even express, anger about the other parent in front of the kids or those kinds of things. If the conflict between the separating parents continues, the danger is that the child going back and forth in visitation is going to be, that's where this non-combatant participant thing comes in, is going to be used, as a kind of a messenger back and forth, and as a sort of a reporter about what's going on in each other's home and those kinds of things. And it can get to be very messy. And so, we want to encourage parents to be very sensitive to the needs of their children and to set their own anger aside. One thing that's very important for those parents to understand this positive attitude about the other parent. The child has to be allowed to love both parents by both parents. And that's so very, very important. If it's handled properly, a divorce isn't going to have to be that conflictual for the child. But again, the younger children at this age are going to have more issues with it than older kids might. Violence is something that children certainly run into, experience, and can intrude upon healthy development. And it's broken down into three different areas here: community violence, domestic violence, and child maltreatment. And children who live in violent neighborhoods, are going to be closer to violence and closer to death more frequently. And that, you can imagine that's going to impact their psyche something terribly. We have talked elsewhere about the effects of domestic violence on children, and I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but again, depending upon how much they're exposed to, how they're exposed to it, and again, that doesn't mean they have to see it, it's just that they're there, what their age is when all this is going on, what kind of relationship they have with each parent, all those kinds of things can interact to increase or lessen the negative impact of domestic violence. Younger children, though, are much more vulnerable because they have so few internal resources to fall back on. They have a hard time, knowing how to tell other people about it and all those kinds of things. So keep that in mind. Child maltreatment. Having spent half of my social work career specifically working with child protection and the other half working in and around child abuse and neglect with my various positions, I feel almost guilty to have like 3 sentences on child maltreatment in this class, but maybe we'll talk about it a little bit more later on. But, again, some of it depends upon the age of the child, the type of abuse, the relationship of the abuser to the child, all of those kinds of things. But the kids who are abused at an early age, this early childhood age, and these children are more vulnerable to abuse at this age, much more vulnerable. And I think this is the age group, I believe, that has the highest percentage of abuse of all the age groups. Those children abused at an early age tend to be more negative and non-compliant and distractible. Now we go back to some of the discussion about how the brain development is impacted by exposure to violence in early childhood, and you can kind of see how that would happen. Children with a history of neglect tend to be more passive than other children, according to the text. My own experience in the field also says that some of those children become bigger acting out because they haven't had the controls placed on them that children need, and sometimes will act out to get attention from adults. Sometimes children from chronic neglect homes can be confused and with attention deficit disorder children. Another matrix, and for some reason in the book, the lower left-hand box doesn't have any, maybe because it's physical impairments. I guess that's what it is. So I goofed up there. But what I put in that box, what goes on, what kinds of things, characterize psychological and emotional abuse. I think I should take that out before I put this into PDF form. But in any event, here's a good matrix for you, and this just really touches upon some of the aspects of child abuse and neglect. If I'd like to hope that I'll have an opportunity to teach a course on family violence again that I've taught in the past. I'll have to mention that to school and see, because there's a great deal of information, and easily you can spend a semester talking about family violence. It's not an easy class to take, but it's a real helpful one. So after all those slides about risk factors, I got one slide for protective factors in toddlerhood and early childhood. So I guess this is a negatively oriented lecture, I suppose. But so is the text. So, I mean, what are the protective factors? Social support, significant relationships outside the family. That's a theme that we're going to run into later on in other age groups, and we'll leave that for now. But the cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, coaches, daycare workers, those kinds of people can all be very, very helpful. A positive parent-child relationship with at least one parent in the family is a protective factor. Having parents that are effective in their parenting, that use techniques that promote self-efficacy and self-esteem and provide good models. High self-esteem in the child, so that even in the face of all those adverse circumstances, the child can continue to persist in the mastery of skills despite the adverse conditions. We're getting back into resilience there. And resilience is not only related to self-esteem, of course. And finally, it's listed here as intelligence, which, contributes to the capacity for mastery and independence and problem-solving skills and so on. So those are some things that if you run into situations where, in early childhood in particular, where there's any troubles, you might look for some of these factors and try to make use of them. So summing up, 2 slides for implications for us social workers. Some of this sounds pretty familiar from earlier chapters, but we'll talk about it again here. Be well acquainted with the theories and empirical research about growth and development among toddlers and young children. Continue to promote the elimination of poverty and the advancement of social justice, because it has impacts all through the stages of life development, but it's so much more severe with children, I think, the long-term impact. Collaborate and in working to eliminate violence in our society. And don't be intimidated by persons who seem married to various aspects of violence in our society. Create and support easy access to services for toddlers, young children, and their parents. Assess toddlers and young children in the context of their environment, in their culture as well, and their socioeconomic status, and so on and so on. Make sure you know the physical and emotional science of child abuse and domestic violence, on the child himself or herself. Behavioral, physical, emotional. We talked about that some in our recent discussion about domestic violence. Engage toddlers and young children in age-appropriate interventions whenever you can. Provide support to parents. Help them develop strong parent-child relationships when they need assistance. Encourage and engage both mothers and fathers in the intervention process where appropriate and possible. We do have a tendency sometimes to let fathers off the hook in this field, and buy into this cultural thing where we see mothers as primarily responsible for child development and all that. And I don't think any of us intellectually believe that, but we fall into that easily enough. So let's make sure we get the old man, if he's around, get the old man engaged in things. And as a guy who's been a single dad with 3 boys of my own, I firmly believe that fathers can contribute a lot to the lives of their children. Not just male role modeling. Provide opportunities for toddlers and young children to increase self-efficacy and self-esteem. And finally, help parents understand the potential effects of the negative environmental factors on their children. And I would add to that, if those negative environmental factors exist, assist the parent in overcoming or eliminating those factors whenever possible. That's it. Kind of a succinct presentation, I think, for Chapter 12. And once again, I hope the information is useful to you and might be something that you'll remember in years to come. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at any time. Thanks, and I'll talk to you later.